The rain came down in sheets that November morning in 1944, turning the muddy fields of eastern France into a gray, waterlogged nightmare. Corporal James Harker sat hunched beneath the canvas tarp of a supply tent, his fingers working methodically despite the cold that had settled deep into his bones. Around him, the sounds of war echoed across the landscape. Distant artillery fire, the rumble of trucks moving supplies forward, the occasional shout of sergeants organizing the next push. But Harker's world had narrowed to the task before him. Spread across a makeshift workbench were dozens of ammunition belts for the Browning M1919 machine guns, each one damaged, worn, or partially destroyed from weeks of continuous combat. The fabric belts, designed to feed cartridges smoothly into the guns that kept American infantrymen alive, were falling apart. The problem was epidemic across the entire division. Nobody else seemed particularly concerned. After all, new belts were always on their way from supply depots in the rear, but Harker knew something the others didn't seem to grasp. In the chaos of modern warfare, supply lines didn't always hold. He'd seen it before, during the fierce fighting after the breakout from Normandy. A single disrupted convoy could leave an entire company without the ammunition they needed to survive. So while other soldiers cleaned their rifles or wrote letters home during rare moments of rest, Harker experimented. He'd been a tailor's apprentice before the war, working in his uncle's shop in Philadelphia. His hands knew thread and needle the way a pianist knows keys. Now he was applying that knowledge to a problem that could mean life or passing for the men he served alongside. The standard ammunition belt was a marvel of simple engineering. Canvas pockets that held individual rounds, connected in long strips that fed through the machine gun's mechanism. But canvas wore out, it frayed, it tore, and when humidity and mud entered the equation, the fabric could become unreliable, causing jams that could silence a gun at the worst possible moment. Harker's solution was unconventional, to say the least. He was stitching damaged belts together using a technique he'd learned for repairing heavy canvas in his uncle's shop. Not just any stitch, but a reinforced lock stitch that created a seamless connection between belt sections. The result looked crude, thick thread visible along the splice points, but Harker believed it would hold. "What in God's name are you doing, Harker?" The voice belonged to Sergeant William Dutch, a career soldier who'd fought his way across North Africa and Sicily. Before landing at Normandy, Dutch approached the workbench, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism only a combat veteran could muster. "Fixing belts, Sergeant," Harker replied without looking up. "Fixing them?" Dutch picked up one of the completed belts, examining the stitched splice with obvious disdain. "Looks more like you're playing seamstress. This is combat equipment, son, not a Sunday dress." The comment drew laughter from several nearby soldiers who'd gathered to watch. In the brutal hierarchy of a combat unit, Harker was still relatively new. He'd joined the division as a replacement after heavy casualties during the push through France. His background as a tailor's apprentice had earned him the unofficial role of company armorer, but it hadn't earned him respect. Not yet. "These stitched splices won't hold up in combat," Dutch continued, tossing the belt back onto the table. "First burst from a Browning, and those threads will tear right through. You're wasting your time and our supplies. With respect, Sergeant, I've tested the tensile strength." "Tensile strength?" Dutch's laugh was sharp. "This ain't a laboratory, Corporal. When rounds are cycling through at 400 per minute and some German kid is trying to put a bullet through your skull, your fancy stitching's going to fail. Mark my words." The other soldiers joined in the mockery. Private Chen called him Susie Seamstress. Corporal Morrison suggested he might be better suited for a quartermaster unit in the rear. Even the usually quiet Private Rodriguez couldn't resist a smirk, but Harker kept working. That night, after the others had settled into their bedrolls, he continued by lamplight, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Each stitch had to be perfect. Each splice had to be stronger than the original belt, because somewhere in his gut he knew these belts would matter. The division pushed forward 3 days later, advancing toward the German positions along the Moselle River. The weather remained miserable. Cold rain mixed with sleet that seemed designed to make every soldier's life as uncomfortable as possible. Harker rode in the back of a supply truck, his specially prepared belts packed carefully in wooden crates marked with his own handwriting, "Modified, handle with care." The mockery continued. When they established a new forward position in a partially destroyed farmhouse, Dutch made a point of having the regular belts issued to the machine gun teams first. Harker's modified belts remained in their crates, unused and unwanted. "We'll save your sewing projects for when we run out of the real thing," Dutch said, not unkindly this time. Combat had a way of softening even the hardest men, and Dutch recognized that Harker's intentions, however misguided he thought them to be, came from a genuine desire to help. The German counterattack came just before dawn 2 days later. Intelligence had suggested the enemy was in full retreat, disorganized and demoralized. Intelligence was wrong. The sound began as a distant rumble that could have been mistaken for thunder if thunder came with such methodical precision. Then the shells started landing. Mortars at first, then heavier artillery that shook the farmhouse foundation and sent plaster raining down from the ceiling. The Americans scrambled to their positions, knowing what artillery preparation meant. They were coming. Through the gray morning light, shapes emerged from the tree line 400 yards distant. German infantry, advancing in squad rushes while their machine guns provided covering fire. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of armored vehicles, half-tracks, and at least 2 tanks. The American response was immediate. Rifles cracked from the windows of the farmhouse. The company's 2 mortars began dropping rounds on pre-registered positions. And the machine guns, the M19-19 Brownings that were the backbone of the defense, opened up with their distinctive staccato rhythm. Harker found himself running ammunition to the gun positions, wooden boxes of belted cartridges growing lighter as he delivered them to the desperately firing crews. The sound was overwhelming, the crack of rifles, the deeper boom of the German machine guns, the whistle of incoming mortar rounds, and underneath it all, the steady hammering of the Browning. Then disaster struck at the most critical moment. The forward machine gun position, set up in a reinforced position covering the main approach to the farmhouse, suddenly fell silent. Harker saw the gunner, a kid from Iowa named Patterson, frantically working the charging handle while his assistant gunner tried to clear a jam. The belt had torn completely through during feeding, leaving several cartridges jammed in the mechanism. "Belt's shot," Patterson yelled. "We need a fresh one?" His assistant gunner reached for their reserve belts, pulling one from the wooden crate. Loaded it. 3 bursts. The belt failed again, this time separating at a weak point in the worn canvas. Patterson swore, already reaching for another. "How many good belts we got left?" he shouted. 2, maybe 3. The German infantry sensed the weakness. They were advancing faster now, using the gaps in suppressive fire to close the distance. 200 yards, 150. Harker made a decision. He sprinted to the supply area where his modified belts waited in their carefully marked crates. His hands shook as he pried one open, but not from fear, from desperate hope that he hadn't been wrong, that his uncle's techniques, applied to instruments of warfare instead of clothing, would actually work. He grabbed 3 of his stitched belts and ran back to Patterson's position, staying low as bullets zipped overhead. The German machine gun fire was finding their range, chewing into the wooden frames around the gun position. "Try these!" Harker thrust one of his modified belts toward Patterson. The gunner looked at the stitched splices, and his face showed pure disbelief. "Are you insane? These are your sewing projects? They'll fail." "They won't. Just trust me." There wasn't time to argue. Patterson's regular belts were done. The Germans were at 75 yards and closing. He could see their faces now, young men with terror and determination in equal measure, charging across open ground because that's what soldiers do when ordered. Patterson made his choice. He loaded Harker's modified belt, pulled the charging handle, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning came to life. 50 rounds, 100. The gun kept firing. Patterson swept the approaching German infantry line, forcing them to ground. The stitched splices fed through the weapon's mechanism smoothly. No hitches, no tears. 200 rounds, 300. "It's holding!" Patterson's voice carried a note of wonder beneath the urgency. "It's actually holding." The psychological impact on the German assault was immediate. They'd timed their attack to coincide with what they thought would be a gap in the American defense when the machine gun ran dry or jammed. Instead, they met continuous fire from a weapon that refused to stop. 400 rounds, 500. Harker watched, transfixed, as his stitched belt fed through without failure. Each splice point that had been mocked as crude workmanship passed through the feed mechanism flawlessly. The tension he'd maintained in each stitch, the reinforcement pattern he'd used, the quality of thread he'd selected, it was all working exactly as he'd calculated. The German attack faltered. Men who'd been advancing with desperate courage found themselves pinned down under fire that wasn't supposed to be there. Their supporting machine guns tried to suppress Patterson's position, but other American guns had come back online now, creating interlocking fields of fire. 600 rounds, 700. Word spread through the American positions with the speed of wildfire. Harker's belts work. The stitched ones work. Machine gun teams were calling for them now, their voices urgent. Harker found himself running from position to position, distributing his modified belts to crews who, half an hour earlier, had been mocking them. The other Browning position, manned by Corporal Davis and his team, loaded one of Harker's belts, then another. They fired burst after burst. The gun heated until the barrel glowed, but the belts held. 900 rounds, 1,000. The German commanders, watching from their observation posts, must have been baffled. Their intelligence had reported American supply problems, shortages that should have limited the defenders' ability to maintain fire. Instead, they were facing machine guns that seemed to have unlimited ammunition. 1,200 rounds through Patterson's gun. The barrel was so hot they had to pause to swap it out, but when they resumed firing with a fresh barrel and another of Harker's modified belts, the weapon responded immediately. No jams, no failures. 1,300 rounds. 1,400, the German assault broke. Not suddenly, but in stages. First, the forward squads pulling back to covered positions, then a general retreat as casualties mounted, and the attack lost momentum. American mortars followed them with harassment fire, and the machine guns, loaded with Harker's stitched belts, maintained suppressive fire that prevented any attempt to regroup. 1,500 rounds through Patterson's position alone. When the smoke began to clear and the German artillery preparation for a second assault never came, a strange quiet settled over the battlefield, the kind of quiet that follows violence, where every sound seems too loud, and every survivor moves as though in a daze. Patterson's gun had fired through 2,000 rounds without a single feed failure. Every belt had been one of Harker's modified ones, and every splice had held. Sergeant Dutch found Harker sitting against the wall of the farmhouse, hands still shaking from adrenaline, surrounded by empty wooden crates that had held his stitched belt. The sergeant's face was impossible to read, lined with exhaustion and battle stress. Then he extended his hand. "I was wrong," Dutch said simply. "Dead wrong. You saved a lot of lives today, Corporal." Harker took the hand, too emotionally wrung out to respond with anything but a nod. Patterson approached, his face blackened by powder smoke. 2,000 rounds, he said, his voice carrying an edge of reverence. 2,000 rounds through belts that everyone said would fail after the first burst. How? It's about understanding stress points, Harker explained, his voice hoarse. In tailoring, when you join heavy fabrics, you have to account for tension and movement. It's the same principle. The stitching pattern distributes the load across multiple threads. Each stitch reinforces the others, and I used a thread grade that's actually stronger than the canvas itself. You need to teach this, Dutch interjected. Every armorer in the division needs to know how to do this. Word of Harker's innovation spread through the regiment, then the division, and eventually reached command levels where decisions were made about equipment and tactic. Within a week, Harker found himself pulled from frontline duty to train other armorers in his technique. He demonstrated the stitching pattern on a battered sewing machine that supply officers located in a bombed-out French village, his audience consisting of skeptical career soldiers who'd never threaded a needle in their lives. But skepticism evaporated when they saw the results. Belts that would have been discarded as unusable were given new life. Supply shortages that would have limited combat effectiveness were mitigated, and machine gun crews gained confidence that their weapons would keep firing when lives depended on it. The technique wasn't officially adopted by the Army. Bureaucracy moved too slowly for that, and there were concerns about standardization. But unofficially, Harker's method spread throughout units fighting in Europe. Armorers shared the knowledge. Machine gun crews requested the modified belts, and when soldiers needed equipment they could trust, they turned to solutions that worked regardless of whether they looked conventional. Private Chen, who'd dubbed Harker Susie Seamstress, approached him one evening after a training session. The young soldier looked embarrassed. "I owe you an apology," Chen said. "I gave you a hard time about the stitching. I didn't understand what you were doing." "It's forgotten," Harker replied. "No, it's not. You kept working even when we made fun of you, even when the sergeant told you it was useless. That took courage." Chen extended his hand and Harker shook it, recognizing that this was as close to an olive branch as combat infantry ever offered. The winter of 1944 brought new challenges. The Battle of the Bulge erupted, Germany's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the initiative. American units found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply lines, fighting with whatever equipment and ammunition they had on hand. Harker's modified belts proved their worth again. Machine gun crews, isolated and under siege, were able to keep firing because the belts they had could be repaired, reinforced, and reused. When supply trucks finally broke through to the surrounded units, commanders found gun positions where hundreds of rounds had been fired through belts that should have failed dozens of times over. One particularly detailed after-action report from the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne mentioned a machine gun team that had defended a critical crossroads for 18 hours straight, firing more than 3,000 rounds through belts that had been stitched together using a technique developed by an armorer from a Pennsylvania division. The report didn't mention Harker by name, but word filtered back through the grapevine. His innovation had reached even the paratroopers. As winter gave way to spring and the Allied advance pushed deeper into Germany, Harker found himself back with his original unit. The mockery had been replaced by respect. When he walked through the company area, soldiers greeted him by name. The machine gun crews, in particular, treated him like a valued member of their fraternity. Sergeant Dutch had been promoted to platoon sergeant, and he made sure that Harker's contribution was recognized in official reports. A commendation worked its way through channels, citing ingenuity and technical expertise that contributed significantly to combat effectiveness. But for Harker, the real recognition came from the soldiers whose lives had been touched by something as simple as thread and needle. Patterson, the machine gunner who'd first tested the stitched belts under fire, kept one of the modified belts as a personal memento. He showed it to Harker before they shipped out to their next position. "This belt right here," Patterson said, running his fingers over the stitched splices. "This fed 500 rounds during that German counterattack. 500 rounds when we needed it most. I'm keeping it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Harker asked. "That sometimes the guys who seem least like warriors, who get made fun of for doing things differently, turn out to be the ones who make the difference. My rifle kept me alive, but your belts kept all of us alive." The war in Europe ended in May 1945. When the shooting finally stopped and soldiers began the long process of returning home or preparing for the invasion of Japan that never came, Harker found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from a tailor's shop in Philadelphia to a battlefield in France. He'd learned something profound about innovation and necessity. The best solutions often come from unexpected sources. A tailor's apprentice had solved a problem that trained armorers and military engineers had accepted as unsolvable, not through revolutionary technology or complicated engineering, but through the application of basic craftsmanship to a new context. On one of the last nights before his unit began rotation home, Harker sat around a fire with the men he'd served alongside. The conversation drifted, as soldier talk does, covering everything and nothing. Eventually, someone brought up the topic of what they'd do when they got back to civilian life. "I'm going back to the shop," Harker said. "Back to tailoring." "You going to tell people about this?" Chen asked. "About the belts?" Harker shook his head. "Who'd believe it? It sounds crazy when you say it out loud. A tailor's apprentice using sewing techniques to fix machine gun belts." "It's not crazy," Dutch interjected. The grizzled sergeant, who'd been the harshest critic at the start, spoke with conviction. "It's brilliant. You took knowledge from one field and applied it to another. That's not just fixing a problem. That's innovation." Patterson added his own thoughts. "You kept working even when everyone told you it wouldn't work, even when we made fun of you. That's not just skill, that's character." The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the German night sky. In the distance, someone was playing a harmonica, the notes carrying across the camp. The war was over, or almost over. Soon they'd all be heading home to try to rebuild the lives that had been interrupted by years of violence and chaos. But in that moment, sitting around the fire, Harker felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, though there was some of that. More a sense of having done something meaningful with the skills he'd been given. The modified belts, crude as they appeared, had kept machine guns firing during the moments that mattered most. They'd given soldiers the confidence that their weapons wouldn't fail them. And in a war where mechanical reliability could mean the difference between survival and being lost, that confidence was priceless. When Harker finally returned to Philadelphia 6 months later, he did go back to his uncle's tailor shop. The work was familiar, measuring customers, cutting fabric, running thread through needles that seemed impossibly small after handling ammunition belts. The rhythm of civilian life slowly replaced the rhythm of military routine, but he kept one of the modified belts folded carefully and stored in a wooden box in his apartment. When customers came to the shop, they saw a quiet young man who did excellent work with fabric and thread. They didn't know that those same hands had created something that saved lives during the most desperate moments of combat. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Harker would take out the belt and run his fingers over the stitched splices. He'd remember the sound of the Browning firing, the desperate charge of German infantry across muddy French fields, the face of Patterson as he realized the belt was going to hold. He never talked about it much. War stories seemed inadequate to capture the reality of what had happened. But when veterans groups met, when old soldiers gathered to remember fallen comrades and survived battles, Harker would occasionally share the story of the stitched belt. The reactions were always the same: initial disbelief, then amazement as the details became clear. How could something so simple make such a difference? How had no one thought of it before? The answer, Harker always explained, was that sometimes solutions come from looking at problems differently. Military engineers had approached ammunition belt reliability as a manufacturing issue, something to be solved through better materials and factory processes. But Harker had approached it as a repair problem, something to be solved through craftsmanship and ingenuity. His uncle, the master tailor who'd taught him everything about working with fabric and thread, understood immediately when Harker finally explained what he'd done during the war. The old man nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "You used the reinforced lock stitch," his uncle said, "the one I taught you for joining heavy canvas." "Yes, and they laughed at you." "At first?" His uncle's smile widened, but then it worked. Of course it worked. That stitch has held together circus tents in windstorms. Why wouldn't it hold together ammunition belts? It was that simple and that complicated. Knowledge from one field applied to another, persistence in the face of mockery, trust in basic craftsmanship over assumptions about what would or wouldn't work. The years passed. Harker married, had children, built a life that had nothing to do with warfare or machine guns. The tailor shop prospered. Philadelphia rebuilt from the war years and grew into the modern world. The Second World War faded into history, remembered but no longer immediate. But occasionally, very occasionally, Harker would hear from one of the men he'd served with. A letter would arrive, usually around Veterans Day or the anniversary of a particular battle. The writers would share updates about their own lives, but they'd always mention the belt. Patterson wrote to say he'd become an engineer, inspired by seeing how simple innovation could solve complex problems. Chen sent a photograph of his family with a note thanking Harker for keeping the guns running when it mattered. Even Dutch, the hardened sergeant who'd first dismissed the stitched splices as useless, wrote a letter shortly before he passed away in the 1970s. "I've thought a lot about that day," Dutch wrote, "about how wrong I was to dismiss your idea. I learned something important from you, that wisdom can come from unexpected places, that the measure of a solution isn't how sophisticated it looks, but whether it works. You taught me that, and I've tried to pass that lesson along to others. Thank you." Harker kept that letter, along with the modified belt, in the wooden box, proof that innovation isn't always about grand inventions or revolutionary technology. Sometimes it's about seeing possibilities that others miss, about having the courage to try something new even when everyone around you is skeptical, about understanding that knowledge from any field can be valuable if applied with skill and insight. The story of the stitched belt splices never made it into official military histories. No technical manuals were written describing Harker's technique. The innovation remained unofficial, passed along through word of mouth and hands-on demonstration, the way soldiers have always shared knowledge that keeps them alive. But for the men who were there that November morning in 1944, when German infantry charged across rain-soaked French fields and Browning machine guns fired 2,000 rounds without pause, the story was unforgettable. They'd witnessed something remarkable, not a miracle of modern weapons technology, but a triumph of simple craftsmanship applied in the right place at the right time. They'd watched their comrades mock a quiet corporal who worked with needle and thread, while others cleaned their weapons. They'd heard sergeants dismiss his innovations as useless. They'd joined in the laughter at Susie Seamstress and his crude-looking stitched belt. And then they'd watched those same belts feed rounds flawlessly through overheating guns during the most desperate moments of combat. They'd seen an idea that everyone thought would fail prove itself under the harshest possible test. They'd learned that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or factories, but from individuals who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. In the end, that was Harker's greatest contribution. Not just the technical innovation of the stitched belt splices, though that was certainly valuable, but the demonstration that ordinary soldiers with specialized knowledge could make extraordinary differences, that craftsmen and technicians and people from civilian trades brought perspectives that professional warriors sometimes lacked. The ammunition belts Harker modified are long gone now, used up in the fighting or discarded when better solutions eventually emerged from official channels. The men who fired those rounds have mostly passed away, their stories fading like old photographs left too long in sunlight. But the principle remains. In any crisis, whether warfare or any other human endeavor, solutions come from unexpected places. Innovation isn't the exclusive domain of experts and specialists. Sometimes the person who sees the answer is the one everyone else overlooked. The tailor's apprentice with needle and thread, the mechanic with an understanding of stress and load, the cook who knows chemistry, the farmer who understands weather and terrain. Harker returned to his tailor's measuring tape and scissors, his contribution to the war effort largely unrecognized outside the small circle of men he'd served with. But in those crucial hours when machine guns had to keep firing and lives hung in the balance, his stitched belt splices had made all the difference. They laughed at him, until 2,000 rounds fed through without pause. Until survival depended on innovation that looked crude but worked flawlessly. Until a tailor's apprentice taught career soldiers that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the ones that make the most noise, but the humble improvements that keep the fighting tools working when nothing else matters. And in the larger story of human ingenuity and persistence, in the ongoing narrative of how ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges, James Harker's stitched belt splices remain a small but perfect example of what's possible when skill meets necessity, when craft meets courage, when someone refuses to accept that a problem has no solution. They laughed, then they learned, and they survived.